She was minutes away from boarding a flight that could define her career until a white stranger pointed at her and shouted, "She threatened me." Within seconds, a black executive became a suspect, and what happened next will leave you speechless. Naomi Bryant woke with a jolt, heart hammering in her chest as if someone had shouted her name in the dark. The room was silent, still wrapped in pre-dawn shadows, but she could feel the tremor of something wrong, like the world had shifted a degree off balance while she slept. There was no memory of a nightmare, no specific image she could hold on to. Only that breathless, haunting certainty that something was coming, something that would change everything. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment, eyes locked on the faint light bleeding through her blinds. It was just past 4 a.m. She wasn't due to be at the airport for at least 2 hours, and yet the idea of lying back down felt impossible. Her skin tingled with urgency, her thoughts refusing to settle. The flight from Dallas/Fort Worth to Los Angeles was supposed to be routine, just another dot on the calendar of her fast-moving life. But this morning felt different, electric, fragile. She stood, moving through her apartment like a woman underwater, each movement deliberate, precise, almost rehearsed. The shower was hot, almost scalding, but it didn't wash the unease from her. Her usual black blazer hung ready on the closet door, her name badge for Skylux Airlines clipped perfectly at the breast. Naomi was the newly appointed senior vice president, smart, stylish, respected. She had weathered boardroom battles, corporate politics, the subtle and not so subtle bias of being a young black woman in a world dominated by older white men. She'd survived all that. And yet, here she was, trembling before a morning flight. It was just a business trip. That's what she told herself as she poured coffee into a travel mug and stepped into the cool silence of the parking lot. Her car started with a low purr, headlights slicing through the blackness as she pulled onto the nearly empty highway. The city hadn't yet stirred, but the voice in her head, quiet, persistent, whispered that today wasn't going to unfold the way she expected. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the big picture. This meeting in LA could solidify Skylux's most ambitious partnership yet. It was the kind of deal that would define her legacy. At the airport, the familiar chaos of early morning travel buzzed around her like static. Tired travelers shuffled through security lines, dragging strollers and overstuffed carry-ons, while automated voices crackled over loudspeakers with gate changes and flight delays. Naomi checked the board. Her flight to Los Angeles was on time, gate C-32. She let out a breath, one small victory. She had this. She approached the Skylux priority counter and handed over her ID. The attendant offered a bright, almost overly eager smile. "Ms. Bryant, always an honor." Naomi returned the smile, her mask of composure firmly in place. No one could know that her hands were slightly trembling, that she had barely slept, that her heart hadn't stopped racing since she opened her eyes. Badge clipped, boarding pass in hand. She moved through security like she had hundreds of times before. Shoes off, laptop in bin, hands outstretched for the scanner. Nothing beeped. No alarms. No issues. Still, as she retrieved her belongings, she couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on her. Not the casual glance of passers-by, but something sharper. She turned, scanning the terminal, but saw nothing out of place. It was all in her head. Had to be. She made her way toward the concourse, heels clicking softly against the tile, dodging a family arguing in Spanish and a businessman on his phone speaking Mandarin at lightning speed. She found a small cafe near her gate, the line mercifully short. The scent of roasted beans and warm pastries offered a brief comfort. She ordered a vanilla latte, gave the barista a polite smile, then stepped aside to wait. That's when she saw him. The man, tall, white, mid-50s, wearing a wrinkled gray polo shirt with a faded golf logo on the chest. He stood behind her in line, arms crossed, impatience written all over his face. She didn't think anything of it at first, until he muttered, loud enough to be heard, "Figures?" Naomi turned, startled. His gaze was fixed on the menu, but the bitterness in his tone hung in the air like smoke. She felt her shoulders stiffen. Was it directed at her? She didn't respond. Not here, not now. She was too close to the gate, too close to her goal. She told herself to let it go. Her name was called. She reached for her drink just as the man stepped forward. Too close. His shoulder grazed hers, hard enough to spill a bit of hot foam over the lid. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a grumble under his breath and a snatch of his order. Black, large, and make it fast. Naomi steadied her hand, heart pounding again. She didn't make a scene. She wouldn't. Instead, she found a quiet seat near gate C32 and opened her laptop, though she barely saw the screen. Key. She sipped her coffee and tried to focus on the presentation. Market analytics, merger implications, team transitions. But her mind kept drifting back to that moment, to his expression, his tone, the sheer, casual entitlement of it. She thought of all the times she'd swallowed indignity like this before, on planes, in boardrooms, in elevators, 100 microaggressions that piled up like grains of sand in her throat. The final boarding call echoed over the intercom. Naomi stood, rechecking her pass. She approached the gate, handed it to the agent, and waited for the scanner to beep green. That's when the voice came, sharp and loud enough to cut the air. Her. That's her. She threatened me. The words didn't register at first. It was like hearing someone shout in a foreign language, familiar sounds but no meaning. Then she turned and saw him again, the man from the cafe. His eyes burned with something cold and ugly. He pointed directly at her. She told me I'd regret pushing past her. She said I should watch my back. That's a threat. I want her pulled off this flight. Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers. The gate agent froze mid-scan. Naomi's body went rigid. What? She managed barely more than a whisper. That's not true. I didn't say anything to him. The man stepped closer, waving his arms for emphasis. She got in my face at the cafe, said she had power, said people like me always pay. Naomi's breath caught. She looked at the gate agent, the security officer approaching with a hand already on his radio, and the faces around her, suspicious, curious, afraid. No, she said, louder now. He's lying. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. The security officer blocked her path. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside. No, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't. Step aside, now. Her flight was boarding behind her. The presentation was waiting in Los Angeles. Her entire career was teetering at the edge of something she couldn't name. She stood frozen, heart pounding, not in fear, but in disbelief. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And just like that, a routine trip shattered into 1,000 sharp-edged pieces. Naomi stood suspended in the moment, the way a glass teeters just before it shatters. The weight of 100 eyes bore down on her as the man in the gray polo, whose name she still didn't know, spun a story that was as outrageous as it was terrifying. She could barely process the words he hurled with such conviction, that she had threatened him, that she said he would regret his actions, that she told him to watch his back. All lies, but lies spoken with certainty, in a space built on rules and caution, often traveled faster than truth. The gate agent, visibly flustered, looked from the man to Naomi and then to the security officer who now loomed just behind her. Naomi opened her mouth to protest, to explain, but her voice faltered beneath the weight of the moment. Her fingers tightened around her boarding pass as though holding it tightly enough might anchor her to sanity. The beep of the scanner never came. Instead, she was gently but firmly steered aside as the boarding line continued moving without her. Ma'am, I need to ask you to come with me, the officer said in a low, firm tone. His words were polite, but his posture left no room for negotiation. Naomi blinked at him. I haven't done anything wrong. The officer didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man in the gray polo lingered just feet away, arms folded smugly across his chest as though justice had been served. Naomi didn't even know what to call what she was feeling. Disbelief, fury, fear, humiliation, all crashing together, crashing into her at once until she felt like she was drowning in plain view. As they walked away from the gate, Naomi could still hear the murmurs from behind her. Some people looked confused, others wary, but no one stepped forward. No one said, I saw what happened. She didn't say a word. That kind of clarity only existed in courtroom dramas. In real life, suspicion wore a uniform, and innocence had no badge. They led her down a sterile corridor to a small waiting area tucked behind a frosted glass door. The room had the ambiance of an interrogation cell designed by a chain hotel, bright, bland, cold. A metal chair, a small desk, a stack of outdated magazines that no one would ever read. Naomi sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, fighting to keep her breath steady. She had always considered herself composed under pressure. She'd handled crises in boardrooms, restructured entire departments, negotiated with tenacious investors. But this was different. This wasn't a challenge to her ideas. This was a challenge to her very identity, her right to be seen and believed. An officer entered and introduced himself as Sergeant Keller. He carried a notepad and wore the weary look of someone who'd seen too many versions of the same drama. He sat across from her, calm and collected, flipping open the pad. Ms. Bryant, we've had a complaint that you made a verbal threat toward another passenger, he said. Before we move forward, I'd like to hear your account of what happened. Naomi inhaled deeply. I never spoke to him. Not once. He cut in front of me at the coffee kiosk. I let it go. He nearly knocked into me. Again, I let it go. I didn't confront him. I didn't even look at him after that. Sergeant Keller jotted a few notes. Did you say anything that could be interpreted as hostile, even unintentionally? I didn't say anything at all, Naomi said, her voice firmer now. If anyone was hostile, it was him, but I didn't respond. I didn't engage. He nodded slowly, flipping to a new page. We'll be checking footage from the coffee kiosk and nearby security cameras. We'll also speak to the barista and any witnesses. That may take some time. She nodded, throat tightening. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we need you to stay here. You're not under arrest, but you are not permitted to board your flight until the issue is resolved. Naomi closed her eyes, the reality of it slicing clean through her. The meeting, the flight, the deal, all gone, or soon to be, because of one man's lie. She wanted to scream, but there was no space for rage in this room, only patience, and the desperate hope that facts would be enough. Time bled slowly across the sterile walls. Naomi tried calling her colleague in Los Angeles. No answer. She left a voice message, clipped, restrained, trying to convey what had happened without letting her voice break. She didn't want pity. She didn't want outrage. She wanted understanding. But more than anything, she wanted this nightmare to be over. Across the hall, through a half-open door, she caught a glimpse of the man in the gray polo being offered water by another officer. He looked calm, relaxed. He even chuckled at one point. Naomi felt her stomach twist into knots. He was lying, and he knew it, and the system, so far, was allowing him the dignity of comfort while she sat under fluorescent lights, her life in limbo. She checked her phone again. One bar of signal. No new messages, no sign of rescue. The wait stretched on. Eventually, Sergeant Keller returned, this time with a folder in hand. Naomi sat up straight. We reviewed the surveillance footage from the kiosk, he began. There's no audio, but from what we can see, you did not appear to interact with the complainant in any way. No confrontation, no visible signs of aggression, You stepped aside when he passed you, and that's it." Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "The barista we spoke to also confirms you said nothing out of the ordinary. He didn't hear any threats." Tears burned behind Naomi's eyes, but she forced herself to remain composed. She nodded once, grateful, but not triumphant. "You're cleared to go," Sergeant Keller added. "We're now investigating whether the complainant knowingly filed a false report." Naomi stood, her legs aching with tension. "Thank you." She gathered her things in silence, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavily on her shoulders. It wasn't over, not really. The meeting was lost. Her team was still in the dark, and she would carry this experience with her into every future airport, every interaction with authority, every moment when her identity would be questioned before her intentions were understood. As she stepped back into the bustling concourse, the contrast was staggering. The world had kept moving while hers had been frozen. Children tugged on suitcases, travelers dozed in seats, baristas called out names. It was as though nothing had happened, but everything had. A man had lied, the system had hesitated, and her truth had been tested. She thought of calling someone, her mother, a friend, her boss, but stopped. What would she say? How could she explain the violation of being dragged away not for what she did, but for who someone assumed she was? Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant in Los Angeles. "Everything okay? You missed check-in." Naomi stared at the screen. Then, slowly, she typed back. "Running late. We'll explain soon." Because how do you explain to someone that you've just been made a suspect in your own life? She walked toward the Delta Lounge, the only sanctuary she could think of, trying to piece herself back together. Each step felt heavier than the last. She would catch another flight. She would regroup. But something in her had shifted. A fault line cracked wide open by a stranger's voice. Today had reminded her that for all the progress she had made, for all the titles and accolades, she was still seen by some through a lens of suspicion. And in places like airports, that lens could become law in an instant. And though Naomi had walked out of that holding room physically unharmed, a deeper wound had been carved beneath the surface, one that would take far longer to mend. But she was still standing, and that, at least, was something. The Delta Lounge was quiet when Naomi Bryant entered, her shoulders taut with exhaustion and her eyes searching for refuge. The soft lighting and leather chairs stood in stark contrast to the sterile interrogation room she had just left behind. But the emotional residue of that experience clung to her like smoke. She wasn't just tired, she was gutted, emotionally bruised by the surreal spiral her morning had taken. Her flight to Los Angeles had long since departed. Her meeting had likely started without her, and the man who had lied about her? She didn't even know his name. A lounge attendant offered her a polite nod, gesturing toward a quieter section tucked behind frosted panels. Naomi chose a seat by the window, away from others. She sank into it, exhaling slowly, the muscles in her back finally unclenching. Her carry-on rested at her feet, unopened. Her phone sat face down on the table beside her, buzzing occasionally with calls and messages she didn't yet have the strength to face. She felt hollow, like she'd been emptied out, not by violence but by the quiet erosion of dignity. And yet, beneath that weight, something else simmered. Anger. Not the kind that lashes out uncontrollably, but the deeper, slow-burning kind that reshapes a person's convictions. Naomi had built her career on grace under fire, but this had struck something more personal. It had pierced the myth she had worked so hard to believe in, that competence, professionalism, and achievement would protect her from being reduced to someone else's stereotype. She had been a black woman in America long enough to— A voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Naomi?" She looked up to see Marcus Hughes, Delta's senior customer service supervisor, approaching with urgency in his stride. She recognized him immediately. He was well regarded at corporate headquarters, known for being sharp and unapologetically fair. His presence here at this moment felt like the first breath of oxygen in a room that had been too tight. "Are you okay?" he asked, crouching slightly to her eye level. "I don't know," she said honestly. "It's been a lot." "I heard. Fillmore's office called me. They're concerned. He's concerned. I was asked to find you immediately." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, not from weakness, but from sheer relief that someone believed her without requiring proof. She nodded, motioning for him to sit. "He lied, Marcus. The man. Everything he said was fabricated." Marcus clenched his jaw. "They're looking into it. The airport security team is pulling surveillance and reviewing officer reports. We're involved now, fully involved. Delta won't let this slide." Naomi sat up straighter. "It's not just about me. I mean, yes, it is. But it's also about what this means. If someone like me, an executive, can be dragged aside based on nothing but a stranger's words, what does that say for everyone else who doesn't have a title or a badge to fall back on?" Marcus nodded. "Exactly. That's why Fillmore wants to escalate this. He's already spoken to airport leadership. This isn't just internal anymore. It's systemic." Naomi wiped at her cheek and turned her phone over. Dozens of missed calls, text messages, and emails awaited her. Among them were notes from Kendra, her closest colleague, asking if she was safe. A message from her assistant confirming the meeting had started without her, and one, brief and sharp, from Fillmore himself. "Call me the moment you're able. We're taking this seriously." She called him right then, Marcus still sitting beside her. Robert Fillmore picked up on the first ring. "Naomi, talk to me." Her voice cracked. "I missed the meeting. I'm sorry." "I don't care about the meeting," he said. "I care about you. Are you okay?" "I'm safe now." "But what happened?" "Robert, I didn't think this kind of thing would happen in my own airport. It was humiliating." He paused, then spoke with a slow, measured gravity. "Then let's make sure it never happens again. Not to you. Not to anyone. Marcus and I are pushing for a formal investigation. This isn't going away quietly. You have my word." She nodded, eyes closed. "Thank you." They ended the call. For a long moment, Naomi just sat there in silence. Then she asked Marcus, "Do we know who he is? The man who accused me?" "Not yet," Marcus replied. "He gave a name at security, but they're verifying it. He left the holding area after filing the complaint before the footage was fully reviewed. But once the report is in, if it shows what you say it does, there may be grounds for legal action." Naomi's hands curled into fists on her lap. "He weaponized fear. He used the airport's own security reflexes against me, and he walked away." "Not for long," Marcus said. "Trust me, people are watching this closely." As the minutes passed, the gears behind the scenes began to turn faster. At the airport's operations hub, a chain reaction had already started. Calls from Delta's legal team, Fillmore's executive office, and even board-level directors had begun to flood the airport's leadership. The message was clear. Someone had detained one of Delta's top-ranking executives on the basis of a lie, and the consequences were coming. At the same time, surveillance footage from the cafe was being scrubbed, frame by frame. Officers reviewed Naomi's body language, her position in line, and the barista's testimony. The evidence told a story far different than the one crafted by the man in the gray polo. Naomi had never engaged him. She had stood silently, patiently, allowing him to cut ahead. The barista confirmed this, describing Naomi as polite, quiet, and clearly rushed but respectful. When the report landed on the desk of the airport's head of security, it came with a summary. No sign of verbal threat, no confrontation, and a complainant who had already exited the premises. And more troubling, this wasn't the first time the officer involved, a man named Jared Givens, had been noted for over-escalating passenger concerns without sufficient evidence. As Naomi waited, unaware of these developments unfolding, she tried to find meaning in the chaos. Her instinct wasn't just to protect herself, but to challenge the broken process that allowed this to happen. She had always believed in reform through policy, through quiet, steady influence. But this was different. This was personal. Marcus offered to arrange a new flight to Los Angeles or a hotel if she needed to regroup. Naomi hesitated. She felt raw, exposed, but also galvanized in a way she hadn't expected. "Let's try to get to LA," she said. "I need to show up. Even if I'm late, I need them to see that I didn't vanish, that I stood back up." He nodded and left to make the arrangements. Back at the security office, Sergeant Keller, the same man who had interviewed Naomi, was now drafting a second report, this one clearing her of all wrongdoing. His language was professional, neutral, but it carried an unmistakable undertone of frustration. The complaint had been false. The officer had delayed a passenger without just cause. And now, they were bracing for the inevitable fallout. In his report, he noted that the complainant's body language had seemed agitated and performative, that there were inconsistencies in his timeline, and that Naomi Bryant had shown remarkable composure throughout the ordeal, even as her rights were tested and her dignity compromised. The alibis had held. The truth had taken its time, but it was surfacing. Naomi didn't know all of this yet. But as she boarded her rescheduled flight hours later, she felt something had shifted inside her. She had walked into the airport that morning prepared to present a vision of growth and partnership. She would still do that, but now her message would carry a sharper edge, a deeper purpose. She stared out the window as the runway blurred and lifted beneath her. Somewhere down there, behind concrete walls and conference calls, people were being asked hard questions about why a black woman's word had been doubted so quickly, about what it meant to file a false report and walk away, about systems that acted first and apologized later, if at all. She didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time since morning, she felt like she was in motion again, not just toward a city, but toward something greater. She had been accused, humiliated, and nearly silenced. Now she was rising, not just into the sky, but into a firestorm that might finally force change. And this time, she would not go quietly. The sun was dipping low over the Los Angeles skyline by the time Naomi Bryant stepped off the plane, her heels clicking softly against the jet bridge. She had missed the meeting, missed the moment she had spent weeks preparing for. But she had also gained something she hadn't expected, a deeper understanding of how close injustice always lurked, even behind the polished veneer of professionalism, and a burning clarity about what had to come next. Her mind was a thunderstorm of emotions. Shame that she had been forced to explain her absence with vague language, anger that a lie had nearly rewritten her day and her name, and a strange, aching weariness from holding herself together through it all. Yet beneath it, there was also the slow rise of resolve, a sense that what had happened to her would not end in silence. A car arranged by her assistant waited curbside, and as she slid into the back seat, she opened her phone to find messages still pouring in. Her inbox had shifted from confusion to concern to something sharper, rage on her behalf. Kendra had called twice. Fillmore had sent a brief message. "We need to talk. Tonight." But one message stood out, sitting quietly between the others. It was from a junior colleague, a woman she had mentored months ago, who simply wrote, "This happens to us. All the time. Thank you." Naomi leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. There it was, truth stripped of apology. This happens to us. All the time. She arrived at the hotel where the post-meeting dinner had already begun. Colleagues from both coasts gathered in a reserved dining space, plates half finished, laughter still dancing through the air. As Naomi entered, Silence fell for a beat, not out of awkwardness, but out of acknowledgement. They had all heard. The story had traveled fast, and it had traveled far. Kendra rose first and walked to her, wrapping her in a tight, wordless embrace. Others followed, some offering murmured apologies, others simply pressing her hand or nodding in solemn solidarity. The gravity of the moment filled the room. Naomi wasn't just returning as a latecomer to a business dinner. She was returning as someone who had just experienced the full force of a system bent out of shape and survived it. They offered her a seat, and though she barely had the appetite for it, she sat. She shared a quiet toast with Kendra, who whispered, "You being here means more than the deal ever could." Naomi smiled faintly. She believed her, but the fire inside her had not cooled. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed, Naomi met with Fillmore and Kendra in a private lounge space upstairs. The mood was serious but not somber. Fillmore looked more tired than she had ever seen him, like a man who knew the scope of what was at stake and the scrutiny still to come. "We've already begun formal proceedings with airport security," he said, cutting straight to the point. "Your name will be cleared, but that's not good enough for us. We want accountability from the officer who delayed you, from the man who lied, from the system that let it happen." Naomi nodded. "And not just for me. There are people traveling through those airports every day who won't have a company like Skylux to stand behind them. What happens to them?" Kendra chimed in, her voice low but fierce. "This can't just be about damage control. It has to be about change." Fillmore agreed. "We're drafting a public response, and we're considering proposing new protocols, ones that require additional oversight before a passenger can be detained based on a verbal accusation. We're also looking at officer training around implicit bias." Naomi's eyes didn't leave his. "I want a seat at that table. I want to help design those reforms." "You'll have it," he said. "You'll lead it." That night, in her hotel room overlooking the city she was supposed to have conquered hours earlier, Naomi didn't sleep. She sat at the edge of the bed, replaying everything. Not just the moments at the airport, but the look in that officer's eyes when he first stopped her. The shrug in his voice when she insisted on her innocence. The quiet tension in the gate agent's body as she tried to comply with policy while clearly sensing the wrongness. And then the louder part of the story. The man in the gray polo shirt who had lied with such ease, who had performed outrage like a rehearsed monologue. She didn't even know his name. But she knew this. He had underestimated her. He thought he was stepping over a woman too tired to fight. What he didn't realize was that he had just lit the match that would set off something bigger than either of them. 2 days later, Naomi stood at a podium inside the Skylux headquarters in Atlanta. The room was packed with corporate staff, airport officials, and media personnel who had caught wind of the story. Her name had begun circulating online, paired with headlines about racial profiling, false accusations, and executive resilience. She could feel the nerves buzzing under her skin, but she steadied herself. "I wasn't going to speak publicly," she began, "because the truth is, I didn't want this to become about me. But then I realized it already had. And worse, if I didn't speak up, the next person might not be as lucky." The room was still. What happened to me at the airport wasn't just about one officer or one lie. It was about what happens when assumptions are allowed to dictate action, when policy forgets to ask for proof, when systems meant to protect passengers become weapons of humiliation. Her voice didn't tremble, not once. "This happens to people who look like me, to women, to black travelers, to anyone who doesn't match someone else's definition of safe. And we're tired of being asked to stay calm while we're being mistreated." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "So we're doing something about it. Not tomorrow. Today." She outlined the policy reforms Skylux would be pushing forward: bias training, surveillance confirmation before detainment, consequences for false complaints, and an independent passenger advocacy office to review disputes before they escalate. She ended with a promise, not to retaliate, but to reform. Because redemption doesn't always come from punishing the person who wronged you. Sometimes it comes from making sure they can never do it again. After the speech, the applause was quiet at first. Then it built. Then it roared. In the weeks that followed, changes began to ripple. The officer who detained her, Jared Givens, was placed on administrative leave. Further investigation uncovered other complaints, long buried, quietly dismissed. Now they were being reopened. The man who had falsely accused her, whose real name was eventually uncovered, faced a potential ban from flying with Skylux and a criminal investigation for filing a false report in a federal facility. But Naomi didn't dwell on him. Her eyes were already on the bigger picture. On every airport gate where someone stood under scrutiny because of their skin, on every boarding line where silence kept people from speaking up, on every tired traveler who dared to believe that fairness was a basic expectation, not a luxury. She had crossed a breaking point, but she had not broken. And in rising, she had found something more lasting than vindication. She had found purpose. And that purpose, rooted in pain, now carried the power to rewrite the rules, not just for herself, but for every voice like hers that had once been forced into silence. Weeks passed, but the weight of that morning in the Dallas/Fort Worth airport never fully left Naomi Bryant. It didn't cling to her like a scar, but rather like a thread woven into the lining of her daily awareness, a reminder of how quickly trust can erode, how dangerously fragile dignity becomes in the hands of unchecked authority. Life at Skylux had returned to its relentless pace. Negotiations, boardroom briefings, team restructuring. But for Naomi, something had shifted permanently. Her appeal as an executive, she had become a reluctant symbol, not because she sought the spotlight, but because the spotlight had found her in the darkest corner of a supposedly civilized space. And now, every email she received from a traveler with a story of being profiled, every quiet thank you from a junior employee who saw her speak up and realized they could too, each one etched deeper into her conviction. The moment was no longer just about her. It had become a movement. And movement, she knew, required staying power. Skylux's legal department had been relentless in pursuing accountability. What had initially been an internal inquiry into a disrupted boarding process had ballooned into a full-scale investigation involving airport administration, federal transit oversight, and civil rights advocates. Naomi was briefed regularly, though she didn't request updates out of vengeance. She wanted facts, truth, a record that told the full story, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever sat in a plastic chair under. The findings were damning. Officer Jared Givens, the man who had removed Naomi from the boarding line and interrogated her without clear cause, had a documented history of overreach. Internal memos revealed multiple complaints filed against him over the years, nearly all by travelers of color, many of which had been quietly dismissed or lost in the churn of administrative red tape. Naomi's case had ripped the veil away, forcing scrutiny that could no longer be ignored. Givens was suspended pending disciplinary review, but it didn't stop there. His record was sent to an external review board, and the Department of Transportation began exploring broader implications: how airport policing reinforced inequities in the name of security, and how easily it could be manipulated by a false accusation. Naomi's story became part of a larger case study, prompting questions that no one in authority could afford to dismiss. As for the man who lied, the one in the gray polo shirt who had calmly and deliberately fabricated a threat, he didn't vanish into anonymity. Surveillance confirmed that he had boarded a different flight later that day. But when subpoenaed for questioning in connection with filing a false report, his story unraveled. He admitted under pressure that he had felt provoked, that Naomi's entitlement and attitude had made him feel targeted. And no witnesses could corroborate his version of events, and Naomi declined to pursue personal legal action. That decision puzzled some. Why not take him to court? Why not demand restitution for her time, her humiliation, her missed opportunity in Los Angeles? But Naomi knew that what she wanted couldn't be measured in settlement checks or court transcripts. She wanted the next woman like her to walk through an airport and not wonder if the color of her skin made her a suspect. She wanted policies, not payouts. And that's exactly what she worked to deliver. Together with Skylux, Naomi launched the Equitable Travel Initiative, an internal and external reform campaign designed to address and prevent discriminatory security practices across all Skylux-affiliated airports. They partnered with civil rights organizations, former TSA agents, and policy consultants to develop a comprehensive training program that went beyond surface-level sensitivity. It tackled implicit bias, procedural fairness, and the dangerous weight of assumption. Under Naomi's guidance, Skylux became the first major airline to implement a passenger advocacy desk at every major terminal it serviced, an independent liaison that any traveler could approach if they felt targeted or mistreated. The role of these advocates wasn't to protect the company, it was to protect the traveler's dignity. The story had spread across major media outlets by then. Headlines varied, some fixated on Naomi's title, others on the racial dynamics of the incident. But what endured was the image of a woman who had endured public humiliation and refused to disappear into it. She had used her voice not to punish, but to provoke change, not to shout, but to steady a system wobbling on its foundations. Naomi received invitations to speak, universities, advocacy summits, transportation conferences. She accepted a few, declined most, not because she didn't believe in the message, but because she didn't want her story turned into spectacle. She was not a brand. She was not a cautionary tale or a PR campaign. She was a person who had been silenced and chose to speak anyway. One rainy evening in Atlanta, she sat at her desk long after most of the building had emptied. The city lights outside flickered against the windows, and her office was filled with the low hum of fluorescent lamps and quiet determination. On her screen, a draft of the final policy proposal awaited her approval, the last step before rollout across Skylux's national operations. She read every word slowly, carefully. The policy wouldn't reverse what had happened to her. It wouldn't unmake the hours lost, the pain swallowed, the eyes that had judged her before knowing her. But it would protect others. It would give the next Naomi in line a place to stand, a voice to use, a system that required evidence before accusation. She signed the document. It was done. Later that night, she returned home and stood by the window of her apartment. The city moved beneath her, cars tracing veins of light through streets still damp from rain. She thought about how fragile everything had felt that morning in the airport, how quickly one accusation had unraveled her sense of safety, and how, even now, with policy and public attention on her side, she still carried that moment inside her like a shadow. But she also carried something else. She carried every voice that had whispered thank you, every hand that had reached out, every colleague who had stood beside her, unwilling to let this be just another day the system got it wrong. She carried change. Naomi never saw the man in the gray polo shirt again. She didn't need to. He had already taught her everything she needed to know about how quickly false power can wound. But she also knew this. Next time, his accusation wouldn't be met with silent compliance. It would be met with questions, oversight, and accountability. And Officer Jared Givens? He resigned before formal proceedings concluded. There was no grand apology, no final confrontation, just a line in a memo stating that his employment had ended and that the department was reviewing internal procedures. Naomi read it once, then filed it away. Closure didn't always arrive with thunder or headlines. Sometimes it came quietly, on paper, in policy, in the choices we make when no one is watching. And that, Naomi decided, was enough. She didn't need revenge. She had something far stronger. She had the truth. And this time, it wasn't just heard, it was written into the very structure of the world she moved through. Forever, in the aftermath of all that transpired, after the humiliation, the missed flight, the public reckoning, and the slow, determined rise back into her truth, Naomi Bryant stood as something far more enduring than a survivor of injustice. She stood as a symbol of what it means to rise, to reform, and to reclaim not only your voice, but your dignity, your story, and your power. Her experience did not simply end with apologies or administrative consequences. It became a lens through which thousands began to our Naomi's story reminds us of something both simple and urgent. Dignity is not a luxury, it is a right. But in systems built to protect order, dignity often gets sacrificed when fear speaks louder than facts. Airports, with their loud announcements and relentless efficiency, are supposed to be places of transition, places where journeys begin and end. But for Naomi, and for many others who look like her, they can also become places of judgment. A single moment, a glance, a gesture, an accusation is enough to. What Naomi endured isn't rare, it's not an anomaly. And that's the part that should haunt us most. It is a daily reality for too many people who travel while black, while female, while wearing religious attire, while bearing any identity that triggers someone else's suspicion. It's the reality of being questioned without cause, silenced without apology, and labeled before being understood. Naomi's story doesn't ask us to pity her. It demands that we reflect, and more importantly, act. One of the most powerful lessons we draw from this journey is that silence is not always safety. Naomi had every reason to stay quiet, to protect her reputation, to move on quietly after being vindicated. She had her job, her seat at the table, the next flight, but she chose something harder. She chose to speak. And in doing so, she gave voice to countless others who've walked away from injustice without the platform to demand change. That choice is never easy. To speak up when you're taught to survive by staying small, to challenge systems that say, it's just procedure, to carry the weight of other people's comfort while your truth is dismissed. Naomi didn't speak out because she had something to prove. She spoke out because she knew that accountability without action is just theater. And she wasn't interested in a performance. She wanted transformation. Her story shows us what it means to turn pain into policy, to take the heat of a public spotlight and bend it toward justice. She didn't destroy her enemies. She dismantled their excuses. She didn't wage war. She built reform. Because real leadership, the kind that endures beyond titles and positions, is rooted in empathy and courage. Naomi led by example, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The system gave her no choice. What's equally striking is how this story reveals the duality of power. Naomi, despite her role as senior vice president of Skylux Airlines, discovered that no title could shield her from racial bias in the moment. She had authority, but not immunity. Her badge, her education, her record, all of it was invisible in the eyes of suspicion. And that's what systemic bias does. It erases resumes. It drowns credentials. It tells you, in 1,000 quiet ways, that your worth is conditional. And yet, by the end of this journey, Naomi's power became something far greater than corporate stature. It became the kind of influence that doesn't sit in a corner office. It lives in policy change, in the letters written by those who were moved by her speech, in the barista who now knows their voice matters, in the junior employee who now feels less alone. The story also forces us to confront another uncomfortable truth. Lies are powerful. A man lied. He lied with confidence and clarity and calm. And for a time, that lie was more believable than Naomi's truth. But what he underestimated, what many who rely on false power forget, is that truth has a longer life. Lies may move fast, but truth moves deep. It burrows into the conscience. It finds the cracks in the silence. It shows up in footage, in testimony, in the clarity of reflection. Naomi's vindication came not just through video, but through the courage of people around her. Marcus, who didn't hesitate to act. Fillmore, who elevated her voice instead of suppressing it. Kendra, who stood with her not just as a colleague, but as a sister in solidarity. Change never happens alone. And while Naomi was at the center of the storm, she didn't weather it alone. That's another lesson we hold tight. Allyship isn't a tweet. It's a decision. It's showing up, risking comfort, refusing to look away. As this story spread, people began to ask, what can we do? What's the next step? And the answer lies in a question Naomi asked in that policy room. What happens to the traveler who doesn't have a company behind them? What happens when it's not a VP at the gate, but a student, a mother, a retiree? The truth is, they may not get a second chance. Their name may never be cleared, their story may never be told, and that is unacceptable. That is why Naomi's work matters. The Equitable Travel Initiative is more than an HR program. It's a blueprint for accountability. It says, we don't just believe you, we'll prove it. We don't just train employees, we unlearn the bias baked into procedure. We don't just react to complaints, we design systems that prevent them in the first place. And still, it's not enough. It will never be enough until airports, offices, boardrooms, and sidewalks all hold the same standard of fairness. Until dignity isn't negotiated but guaranteed. Until stories like Naomi's become rare, not routine. So what do we do now? We remember. We stay aware. We use our voices when others can't. We interrupt the lies. We amplify the truth. And we recognize that every system, no matter how polished or professional, is made of people. And people can change. Naomi didn't set out to be a symbol, but now she is. Not just of survival, but of evolution. She is the face of what happens when courage collides with injustice and refuses to bow. This story is not over. It echoes in policy drafts, in staff training rooms, in the hearts of those who watched it unfold and whispered, that could have been me. And maybe it was. Maybe it still is. To anyone who's ever been silenced, let this be a signal. Your story matters. Your voice is needed. Your pain is valid. And your courage is not invisible. To the companies watching, know this: silence is complicity. And real integrity isn't found in public statements, but in private decisions when no one is looking. To the officers and institutions entrusted with safety, remember, suspicion is not truth. Authority is not righteousness. And power is a privilege that demands restraint. And to those who doubt this story's impact, look around. Naomi's face is not on a billboard, but her legacy is in every new policy, every safer flight, every child who will grow up in a world where injustice has fewer places to hide. We hope this story shook something in you. We hope it stirred not just emotion, but action. Because stories like Naomi's are not rare, they are simply untold. And that's where we come in. To tell the stories, to ask the hard questions, to hold the light up to the places where truth has been buried. And if this story moved you, if it lit a fire, made you pause, made you see the world a little differently, then let us ask you for one simple thing: subscribe. Subscribe not because we need numbers, but because we need momentum. Because every time you engage, you help this message travel further. You make sure the next Naomi doesn't walk alone. You make it possible for us to keep telling stories that challenge power, expose injustice, and celebrate courage. Your support fuels the next voice, the next truth, the next chapter. So stay with us, stand with us, and together, let's keep telling stories that matter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.